Insulin resistance doesn't just affect your waistline, it can affect your brain. Most people assume subtle cognitive changes are just aging, but in many cases, the issue isn't time, it's energy. Your brain runs on fuel, and when that fuel becomes hard to use, performance drops. Not dramatically at first, but slowly. You might experience brain fog, slower recall, hunting to find words or phrases, or mental fatigue that didn't used to be there. That pattern can begin years, sometimes decades before noticeable decline. Some researchers are even referring to this as type 3 diabetes, not as a formal diagnosis, but as a way of describing insulin resistance affecting brain function. Once you understand that, the conversation shifts, because what feels like aging may actually be metabolic. Your brain is an energy-intensive organ. Even though it's small, it consumes roughly 20% of your body's energy. That energy comes primarily from glucose. Glucose is fuel, but fuel is useless without proper signaling. Insulin is like a key. It helps unlock the door to the cells so the cells can use that fuel as energy. When insulin signaling weakens, the brain doesn't stop working, it just becomes less efficient. And when efficiency drops, performance drops. Most people assume that's aging, but aging doesn't fully explain energy efficiency. Metabolism does. So the obvious question is, why would the brain become insulin resistant? It's because it follows the same patterns as the rest of the body. Chronically elevated insulin from repeated refined carbohydrate spikes, years of low muscle stimulus, and long periods of inactivity. It could be due to reduced sleep quality and being chronically stressed. Over time, the cells adapt to that constant signaling by responding less. That's insulin resistance. And when that pattern becomes systemic, the brain is not immune. Your cognitive environment reflects your metabolic environment, and that's the connection. Here's the danger of thinking it's just aging. When something feels inevitable, you stop looking for leverage. You stop measuring, you stop adjusting, but insulin resistance rarely stays static. It progresses. And progression means less efficient energy delivery over time. The earlier that inefficiency begins, the longer it compounds. This isn't about one bad year, it's about cumulative years of underfueling the brain. And the cumulative inefficiency is what creates a visible decline later. Now, this isn't theoretical. Large population studies have consistently shown that people with type 2 diabetes have roughly double the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to those without diabetes. That doesn't mean diabetes directly causes Alzheimer's in all cases, but it tells us something very important. The same metabolic environment that drives type 2 diabetes is also associated with higher rates of cognitive decline. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern. And here's something else interesting. Women account for nearly 2/3 of all Alzheimer's cases. Hormonal shifts, metabolic changes, and insulin sensitivity appear to play a major role in that vulnerability. So when we talk about metabolic health, we're not just talking about blood sugar. We're talking about long-term brain resilience. If that connection is even partially true, dismissing early metabolic dysfunction as just aging becomes a costly assumption. Now here's why this often gets missed. Most people check fasting glucose, but very few check fasting insulin. Even fewer evaluate insulin resistance directly. You can have normal blood sugar and still have elevated insulin levels. That means the system is compensating, and it's working harder than it should. That compensation can continue quietly for years, and because cognitive changes are subtle early on, they often get dismissed until they don't. That's where the type 3 diabetes concept becomes useful. Not as a label, but as a reminder that brain health and metabolic health are connected. And here's an important perspective. If memory changes are purely aging, then there's no leverage. If they're partly metabolic, then you have leverage. Insulin sensitivity can improve, metabolic flexibility can improve, and brain energy availability can also improve. The primary lever in all of this is insulin sensitivity. That's the anchor. So how do you become more insulin sensitive? One of the best things you can do is start resistance training. Muscle is like a sponge or like a glucose sink, and it greatly improves your insulin sensitivity. You also want to move as much as you can. Regular movement, even walking after a meal, has a dramatic impact on becoming more insulin sensitive. You also want to manage your refined carbohydrate intake, because if you have continual insulin spikes, that makes you become more insulin resistant over time. You want to prioritize sleep, and you want to reduce your stress as much as you possibly can. These aren't brain hacks, they're metabolic fundamentals. And if you want objective clarity, you can measure it. Things like knowing your fasting insulin levels, your insulin resistance markers, your triglyceride to HDL patterns, and you want to know this information because you want to assess your current state. Because if your brain depends on energy efficiency, then metabolic health isn't cosmetic, it's neurological. Memory loss doesn't always begin with just age. Sometimes it begins with energy deficiency. If you assume every cognitive shift is aging, you start removing leverage. And if you recognize that metabolism may be involved, you reinforce control. That's not fear, that's responsibility. So stay sharp, stay in the game, and I'll see you in the next video.